what I wanted to suggest is that we think a little bit about Wretched of the Earth, maybe a dying colonialism as well. I think one of the things which has been kind of nice to exchange ideas in this respect is that both Sinan and I, it's almost like there's a Fanon reading strategy. Like sometimes a dilemma is posed in a Fanon text, and lo and behold, you often find that there's an interesting response to it in another Fanon text. It's like doing Fanon via Fanon. And yeah, so I mean, you were just talking about the Voice of Algeria chapter in A Dying Colonialism. For me, it's the Algeria Unveiled chapter. It seems to, in some ways, speak so crucially back to black skin, white masks, particularly areas where Fanon is being critiqued for being a masculinist writer or a sexist writer or so on and so forth. The essay on the veil seems to be, and the role of women in the Algerian Revolution seems to be a very nice way of speaking back to that. So we don't have to necessarily talk about that, but here's the question. The famous and challenging and controversial chapter, opening chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, concerning violence. What do you have to say about that chapter? And do you see it as in some ways responding to, in some kind of relationship with some of the ideas propounded in Black Skin, White Masks?
So I think, yes, very much so. I think that there's been a few, should we call them liberal readings of Fanon that seems to think about violence potentially not in as strong way as I think that Fanon had intended. And I think that a lot of the way that I understand that chapter, but also the final chapter of or the appendix of A Dying Colonialism, where he talks about violence there as well, is very much to think about, well, to place it in a kind of history and context of Fanon's work as a psychiatrist, and what it is that he's been trying to do since 1952, 51. And it's to say, and to link it to Lacan as well, which is kind of what I'm most comfortable doing. And I think the only way to understand Fanon's concept of violence is within the kind of paradigmatic view that I put forward in the previous answer, which is to say that once faced with a situation where the very mechanisms for overcoming the paradigm are themselves steeped in the oppression that the paradigm is undertaking. So I think that was a very wordy and theoretical way of saying that something like reason and objectivity are insurmountable. Like, you can't use those concepts from within, imminent to the paradigm, to move beyond it. For example, in the case of racism. So science proved that there's no distinction, and yet oppression, ritualistic abuse, and colonization continued. Okay, so you get to a point where you've tried everything from within the paradigm. You've engaged with religion. You've engaged with in good faith with science. You've engaged in good faith with literature. You've come up against the paradigm as much as possible, and you're still being ritualistically dehumanized. And I think that it's only at that point that Fanon turns to violence. And I think it's an interesting concept because it's remarkably rational. But it's remarkably rational from within, or at least from without, the contemporary paradigm that you're in. So if you live in a certain symbolic structure that says that you need to act in this way and that way, and you feel like you're not getting anywhere, then you need to push beyond such a paradigm. You need to push beyond such a symbolic structure. And I think that strikes me as totally rational. And I think, in fact, the kind of a similar one, if you would think about Thomas Kuhn and about scientists trying to emerge from their paradigm of academic research or whatever, it's kind of paradigmatically the argument. So I think that's how we should understand violence in Fanon. And I think that it's all linked to Lacan's concept of the kind of fertile moments of delirium, which he espouses in his doctoral dissertation, that Fanon brings up in his doctoral dissertation, and that comes up quite a few times in and throughout Fanon's work. It always kind of creeps up when you least expect it. And I think, there's a multiplicity of different ways that this idea could be understood. And I think that the kind of political one that I'm suggesting is to think of it as, well, what would be a fortuitous moment to break out of the system if the aim of Fanon's intervention is to deconstruct the colonial world, then, and which I think is in fact the main aim of Fanon's intervention, then I think that him demonstrating through Black Skin, White Masks the necessary failures of integration, of, for example, learning the colonizer's language, or being forced to, and trying to learn it better than the Frenchman, and trying to use it against the Frenchman. These strategies of kind of fighting back just don't work. It's very much again linked to the mirror stage and the question of assimilation, right? And trying to assimilate to the image. Well, when the image so much rejects you, then there's only so much assimilation you can do. And I think that that's the kind of import of the moment of violence in Fanon. It's linked irremediably to attempting to move beyond a form of rationalism, where the rationalism from within seems irrational to the person who is without it. And so it's trying to apply a different kind of rationality. And that's why I think that it seems, like the worst possible thing that Fanon might have suggested, that violence was an option in a difficult situation, but seems to me totally logical within his kind of trajectory. And the only thing I would add to that is a moment in Black Skin, White Masks, where he references Fanon on a footnote, where he's talking about a Black medical student who is consistently denigrated and oppressed, and wishes almost psychotically for power over the colonized. And I think that it's at that precise moment that Fanon refers to this desperate desire for superior power emerges as a fertile moment. Now, I don't think necessarily that that's always a solution, but in the sense that I don't think that in that example, it's necessarily a solution for that person. But I think structurally, what Fanon is pointing to is pushing at the limits of what is possible from within a colonial paradigm necessitates an irrational moment. And I use the word irrational specifically because it's irrational from within the colonizer's mind, not from without it, where it looks perfectly rational. So if I've been clear, and if that makes sense, I think that's the way that we should understand violence in Fanon.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just a couple of comments, and I haven't really thought this through, but what you make me think of is the one or two moments, maybe more, there's actually, now that I think about it, a lot of moments in Black Skin, White Masks where we have the end of the world, the positing of the end of the only thing worth fighting for. And of course, we see it in the oft-cited notion of the zone of non-being. And also in some of the Hegelian dynamics that seem to imply that death is part of the process, or a struggle with death. So without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, what you suggest to me is very important, because there are a couple of times when earlier Fanon, prior to Wretched Earth, it does have this question of what does it mean to think about the end of the world? And also the suggestion that it would take something tantamount to the end of the world to bring us to this ontology of white racism. So just to stress that, and you could say then that the essay in the violence essay in Wretched Earth is a response to that. But here's another thought that you made me think about, was Robert Bernasconi has often emphasized that when Fanon is talking about violence, some of his, so-called postmodern, post-colonial critics and readers want to say, well, it's not just physical violence. And Bernasconi is always very clear, and as is, Fanon, as far as I can see, that it's not just symbolic violence that's being suggested here. This is kind of the actuality of violence. Now, I get that point. And, I think it would be, in some respects, naive not to get that point. But maybe a sort of Lacanian pass on this would be to say, well, that is significant. It's material, physical, actual violence. But for all of that, don't underestimate the scale and importance and significance of symbolic. The end, violence of the symbolic to end a symbolic world. I want to say also that one of the moments when Fanon posits very, it seems to come out of nowhere, actually. In the first time, one of the times he mentions it, I think he's even talking about the curriculum of Martinican schools or something. This might be just a lyric invention, but he's talking about the longevity and endurance of white stereotypes, of white, of what school children are reading. And then there's this mention of the end of the world. I'm going to probably find it's not there. I've not remembered it correctly, but it's significant. It would be interesting if it does happen. So one question to extend it is how to put the violence essay back in dialogue with Black Skin, White Mask, where we have moments of death, whether we have it's the zone of non-being, which is kind of, in my reading, is a kind of highly ambivalent concept which stresses both the horrors of racism, the utter declivity, whatever, of the zone of non-being, within which not all men of color or people of color will have the opportunity to experience at some level, which is an odd way of saying, here's the hellish reality of racism, but not everyone will have the possibility of transcending it. And sorry, I'm paraphrasing too much. But the reason I'm stressing that is because there seems to be a sort of revolutionary agency that is also incipient within this possibility. But nevertheless, coming back to the point, what happens then if we put, not just if we put the violence essay back in dialogue with Black Skin, White Masks, but we ask the Lacanian question of what does it mean to be between the two deaths? Between the two deaths, Antigone's situation, the place where death drive is a kind of mode of agency. And I suppose what I'm wondering there is between the two deaths being, what does it mean if there's both violence against the colonial world or the world of anti-Blackness, which occurs both at the level of, potentially physically doing something about it, but also at the level of a kind of symbolic violence. So anyways, I haven't got very far in thinking about that, but it's just maybe a kind of move of saying what Lacanian motifs may help further inform or think a little bit further about something like that. But the other thing that you mentioned that was so useful was the question of fertile moments of delirium. And I'll try to be less wordy this time around. But surely this is your implication, right? Given, and Afro-pessimism often talks about the ontological conditions of anti-Blackness. And of course, there's moments in Fanon which seem to verify that conceptualization. But let's then say, if we're talking about the ontological conditions of anti-Blackness is a Weltanschauung, then it's very difficult to transcend it. The word transcend doesn't even seem to work in that respect. So you would need something akin to violence, whether it's symbolic or other words, to get beyond this. And it seems incredibly difficult to kind of imagine. But that's why it's so intriguing when you suggest the fertile moments of delirium, because I think the implication of your argument is not only that the colonial setting, the colonial scene, the colonial situation engenders forms of psychosis and madness, which we see, and we see on the side both of whites and of Blacks, actually, interestingly enough. But that maybe that ambiguous term, just as the zone of non-being is kind of ambiguous conceptually, fertile moments of a delirium also has a similar ambiguity to it, because it's delirium, which on the one hand doesn't sound good. It's not real. It's a delirium. It's a delusion. But there's fertile moments. So I think if I'm correct in understanding you, you're suggesting that there's a kind of liberatory, transgressive political potential precisely in the fertile moments of the delirium, which may open up to an imagining of something beyond the confines of the colonial anti-Black ontology of now. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, you've put it much more elegantly than me, so thank you for that, Derek. I think that there's a few things I want to say because that was very rich. But I think the first thing that I will say is I think that we might need to think about this concept of the fertile moment of delirium, maybe, and I'm hesitant, but I'm saying maybe in this idea of the radio, right, and the hallucination that emerges from such an experience. That could be potentially something that could be we could call a fertile moment of delirium.
That's
Now, I
great.
think,
That's really, really good.
and I think the idea ultimately, for me, comes down to how do we conceptualize freedom in Fanon, and how do we conceptualize freedom in relation to Lacan? Because I think that these are all kind of connected points. Um, I think it's Fanon. I mean, Lacan was quite clear about what he means. That freedom is in the shadow of madness is in the shadow of freedom. He says this in the presentation on psychical causality essay that Fanon cites in his doctoral dissertation. In fact, he cites that precise quote where Lacan says that. And I think that the way that people have traditionally wanted to read Fanon was kind of against this idea of there's an element within freedom that escapes it, that is, well, it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, I think it's Heidegger who talks about freedom in the Schelling essay, and he says that when you're thinking about freedom, and Schelling thought about freedom in the same way, if you try and contain freedom in a very definitional context, then you've trapped freedom, and therefore freedom can't escape from the very definition that you've given it. Therefore, making any concept of freedom not something you can think. So I think that when we think of the concept of madness, we have to include within it an element of freedom. And I think that, I think at one point, Lacan says, les fous, c'est eux qui sont libres. He says the mad, it's them who are free. And I think he says this in 1967 in a talk to the psychiatrists of Sainte-Anne that's actually not published. But this is a very clear thing that Lacan thinks. Lacan thinks freedom through unfreedom, in a sense, or at least what we would think is unfreedom. And in fact, the entire trajectory of Lacanian psychoanalysis is one long meditation on the notion of unfreedom. So, even the homophony, the name of the father, the no of the father, and the non-dupes le nom du père, le nom du père, et les non-dupes shows this quite well, in the sense that once you get to the end of the line, once you get to the moment of the master signifier, which is the non-dupes it means that you have to be a dupe to live. And what does it mean to be a dupe for Lacan? It means that you've accepted to be within a system structure that has language, right? That enables you to communicate with other people. And as soon as you begin communicating with other people, then you're trapped. You're trapped in all kinds of emotional, affective, institutional, sociological, political cages, right? Which in many ways enables life. So it's ambivalent. But what he says about the non-dupes is that ultimately that there's a horizon beyond that. Mystics, women, etc., who live on the other side of that gap. And so it's this idea of the non-dupe which I think is kind of a remarkable moment, which encapsulates the entirety of Lacan's thinking for about 30 or 40 years. So thinking about that end and trying to understand and place and track the way that Lacan was thinking about freedom, and also why it was that Fanon decided to point in this direction to Lacan's concept of freedom, has motivated in many ways my thinking on all of this stuff. And I think a lot of commentators would say that actually Fanon was much closer to Henri A and his concept of the pathologies of freedom, which apparently is at odds with Lacan's concept of the freedom in madness. But it's interesting because I was recently looking through a text that Henri A wrote in the 1970s, and he says actually that these two concepts, although he might not have recognized it at the time, he sees now that he was actually in complete agreement with Lacan, and those two concepts are the same. So I think that Fanon strikes me as someone who understood that there was no distinction and used the two concepts almost interchangeably And I think that it's a bit of a false dichotomy, this idea that we have to choose between Henri A on the one hand and Lacan on the other hand. And I mean, we haven't had much of a chance to speak about this discussion about organodynamism and sociogenesis, which we can do. But I think that it's all linked to understanding the moment that Fanon emerges and the state of kind of psychiatric thinking at the time. Because although there are fundamental differences between organodynamism and psychogenesis, ultimately Henri A and Lacan remain friends, really, really close friends for the rest of their lives. They were really close. And I think that when Henri A dies in the 70s, in the late 70s, Lacan writes he says he's devastated in a letter to Henri A's wife. And, they went to school together, they studied university together, etc. So they're very close. So I think that they push back at each other quite often in a kind of joking, ironic way. I think that's what gets missed. So I'm going on a whole digression, Derek, but the whole concept of the logician of madness is actually a phrase that Henri A uses in a conference to Lacan. And he calls him, oh, you're being a logician of madness. And then he goes on to say, oh, that if we were to follow you and your conception of psychogenesis, there would be no more psychiatry. The way I read these are kind of like jokes within two really close friends who are pushing each other's boundaries. So I think when commentators point to those moments and say, oh, he's being very dismissive of Fanon's being very dismissive of Lacan, etc., there's a whole history that's being missed there. That these are not critiques of each other. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap and similarities between all of these figures. So thinking about how Fanon adopts Lacan's concept of freedom becomes central, and how he relates it to both Henri A and the wider view of the colonial situation. And I think that thinking about forms of madness from a school of thought that doesn't see madness necessarily as problematic. And I think that this is something that is another thing that's worth remembering, is that François Tosquiès, who is, I think we can all agree, has had a remarkable influence on Fanon. He used to say that first we need to, before treating the patient, we have to treat the institution. Il faut soigner l'institution, he says. And I think that Fanon's answer to that would be something like, before treating the patient, before treating the institution, we need to treat the world. We need to first, at that level, think about how it is that we're going to respond to the colonial situation. And I think that the answer is very much from within, thinking about madness as constitutive or helpful in coming to decolonize the entire colonial framework. And it only looks mad from within, because as Lacan says as early as 1932, and the whole point of Seminar 3 on psychosis, etc., is that psychosis is just one expression within a form of a symbolic structure. It might not be the correct one, but these people, they speak, they're sometimes coherent. And he, this is the whole point of Lacan from some of his earliest moments, when he writes in the 1930s, the early work, and he's analyzing the speech of his psychotic patients, and he says, oh, well, actually, there's a syntactical structure, the grammar is correct, although it doesn't mean anything. There's a kind of articulation outside of our frame, and there's this hugely democratizing and humanizing gesture that emerges with Lacanian psychoanalysis. In spite of what people say, people who think that Lacan is a heterosexist theoretician of human oppression have completely misunderstood him. Completely, it's shocking. And then this Lacanian framework gets, adapted by all these guys, Jean Houry, François Tosquiès, people at Saint-Olban, and then it gets democratized further through Fanon, etc. I see a perfectly logical heritage and lineage between those things. And I think that people who try and see difference or antagonism are just misrecognizing antagonism for honest debate.